Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Mastering Retention Podcast. Today is going to be a special episode. We have Matt Baker with us from Trailmix, and we're going to be talking about something that's really near and dear to my heart as a entrepreneur, and that is pivoting. And so we're going to talk a lot about the Love and Pies journey, which if you guys haven't played that already, like pick up that game and play it. I've been playing it and actually loving the game since before the pivot. So it'll be super interesting to delve into things. But pick up the game, check it out. They went from a match 3 to a merge game. But as I've found in advising different studios, angel investing, everyone that I've talked to, all these different studios are all going through similar struggles of what happens when your metrics aren't quite where you want them to be, and how do you analyze where to go, what the problems are in your game. So super excited for today's episode. But before we delve into all of that, Matt, I always like to start with, how did you get into games? Like what's your journey? How did you end up at Trailmix making games?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, first of all. Glad to hear you're enjoying the game. So I've been in the industry for about 16 years now, I think, like relatively old timer. And interestingly enough, I've been pretty much on mobile games since the beginning, which makes me as kind of a special case. I go right the way back to before the iPhone was released, which is a fact I used to inform my nephews about how old I really am.
I think the only place you're missing is like digital chocolate, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So I guess from a very young age, I mean, this is a real cliche, right? But I decided from a young age that I wanted to be working video games. I didn't really know what a game designer was, but about 12 years old, I was like, whoever gets to decide how these things are made and what the ideas are. So there was lots of games that I was playing at the time. I think, I was really into strategy games when I was younger. I think the Bullfrog games especially were some of the games that sort of made me really want to work in games, like the Theme Hospital and Dungeon Keeper and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, there was a big tradition in my family as well, board gaming. So, we were really into board games. I think the first level I ever designed is in the middle of my brother's Hero Quest manual, where you were supposed to photocopy the page and draw your own level designs, but I just took a biro straight to the manual for all time. So yeah, I got a degree in artificial intelligence, pretty much because I just thought it sounded cool. I thought it would help me get into video games as well. It was an interesting degree. It was kind of a mixture of sort of technical computer science aspects, programming, but also more sort of like school courses that are more sort of like about philosophy, or what even is intelligence. You have to answer that question before you can design an artificial version, right? So there are lots of interesting sort of tangents that you could go on this degree. Psychology and stuff was one of the aspects that I really enjoyed, which I think is coming a little bit handy for me.
Oh, yeah.
So I graduated, and pretty much immediately I tried to get jobs in games, but I actually got offered a job at EA as a QA tester. But I did the sort of like the maths on the like the economics of it, and just traveling to where this place was every day, like I just couldn't afford it, basically. So I had to say no to that, unfortunately. And then an older brother's, my friend's older brother got a record deal with Sony, and they said, hey, we know that you play guitar and stuff, why don't you come on the road with us? So I was telling Tom a little bit about this earlier, but yeah, I was a roadie for a while. And so I was actually in a crossroads where I was like, do I continue with my, with games, or do I go into music? And eventually I was on sort of like a hiatus over Christmas, and I got a phone call from a QA outsourcing company that I'd applied to. And they said, come in and do an interview. So I did. And I was, I went through the interview process, got the job, and I decided to take that on, basically. So I got into QA that way. So this was in 2005, I think. And then my first day on the job, I remember somebody handed me a mobile phone. So I remember this was in 2005. So, for most people, gaming on phones at the time was kind of, Snake was probably at the height of most people's minds when you think about that. So I was kind of like, what's the phone for? Where's the PlayStation? but actually looking back at it, it was kind of a lucky break, because I started working on testing early J2ME sort of Java phone games, and it sort of gave me a footing in the sort of testing standards that you needed for phones at the time, which led me eventually to Glue Mobile in London. So this was 2006. And then I worked there for a few years, and then there was an internal promotion for a sort of a junior game designer, and we all went for it, and I got it. So that was kind of, from that point onwards, I was doing game design things, but obviously it was still game design on mobile as we know it today. It wasn't like that. It was kind of the Wild West back then. I don't know if you remember.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I've worked at various places, and I think, you know, I've worked in educational games for children. I've worked at a Toys to Life, like a toy company in America. I worked at a social gambling company for a while, making slots and like casino games. And then ultimately I ended up at King for about 5 years, where I was a principal lead, or like a lead game designer. So I worked on Farm Heroes franchise for a number of years, and then I sort of started my own projects, which ultimately didn't really make it out of soft launch. And then I joined Trailmix.
Cool. So yeah, let's talk about Trailmix a little bit. Yeah, what's happened since you've been there? Like, what have you guys been working on? What have you been doing?
Yeah, so the founding team of Trailmix, so Cara and Tristan are the founders. So they were two people that I met when I joined King. So Cara was actually my first boss. She was the executive producer of Farm Heroes at the time. Tristan was the original lead designer of Farm Heroes, but he moved on to sort of start up a new new games process. That's what he was doing at the time. So I joined to sort of fill a vacancy in the design team on Farm Heroes pretty much when it was at its peak. You know, it was doing very, very well, even though it's not as well known as Candy Crush in its own right. That is still a huge game, you know.
Yeah.
So I joined that team, and through that process, I met a lot of the other founding employees of Trailmix, so a lot of the artists and developers. And so at some point in probably 2017, I think it was, Cara and Tristan left King, and they decided to start their own company. And they sort of made some of their key hires, and like internally, I was thinking, you know, I'd love to work with them again one day, but I felt like there was too much overlap between me and Tristan to really facilitate that too soon. And then we went to the pub one day, and I was saying to Tristan, people keep asking me when I'm going to join Trailmix. And he basically said, well, actually, on that topic, like we've been talking about it, and we were wondering if maybe there's a place for you here. So we discussed it a little bit more. And basically what I really loved was their vision. Their vision was kind of, they want to make snackable games. So all of the stuff that we'd learned at King, I suppose, like, you know, how to make addictive sort of like casual games. They wanted to sort of fuse that knowledge with this desire to sort of put some more good back out into the universe effectively. Exactly how that would manifest wasn't entirely known yet, but it was just that drive, really. It was that vision that sort of resonated with me. And sort of talking about the opportunity, they'd spent, you know, at the point that I joined, I think they'd been going for about a year and a half or so. They'd gone through a few core prototypes, and they'd found this prototype, which was something that they were really excited about, but they needed a meta, and Tristan basically didn't have time to think too much about what that meta layer would look like. And, you know, knowing what I had just come out of doing at King, like my game that had been cancelled, they knew that I had some experience sort of building up new metas around games, basically. So they sort of said, yeah, why don't you join us? So eventually I did, and I joined, and that was pretty much how we started. We sort of divvied up the labor that way. So Tristan was really owning everything to do with the core, because it wasn't just a match 3 game. It was actually a merge match 3 hybrid. So it was a new concept. So it was kind of an interesting.
Yeah, it was kind of like merge before merge was really like a thing, I feel like.
Yeah, possibly to a certain extent. I think they'd already identified merge as a hot topic. Like they knew, like, match 3 is very much a red ocean. It's probably the oceans. So it was about as close to a blue ocean as they'd seen for a while in remotely casual puzzle space. So they knew that they wanted to do something with merge. And they arrived at this thing, and it was the idea, really, the philosophy behind it was sort of combining some of those match 3 motivators and drivers and the theories around how you monetize on it and all that kind of stuff, but applying it to this new mechanic. So really, Tristan had his work cut out, which was, how do we make this thing work? So there was a lot of time spent on that. But there was this other side to the vision, which was narrative, and Tristan especially has always been very heavily narrative focused on the games that he makes.
Mm-hmm.
So like the clear thing for me coming in was, how do we turn this into a sort of how do we inject a narrative into this meta in a way that's going to work for us in the long term? So that was kind of my focus going forward.
That's awesome. Cool. So you guys have been working on this for a while. So, I feel like it was out in soft launch for a while, and then the pivot happened. So maybe talk about like what the game looked like before the pivot. And I don't know if you can share how things were going, like how far from where your target numbers were or anything like that. But like, what led to you guys saying, hey, I think we need to pivot to something else?
Yeah, so we're talking about like a singular pivot, the pivot that happened earlier this year. In my mind, the game has probably been pivoted several times, really. I think, people talk about like how long have we been working on that game, and really, like, we've probably built about 6 games by this point, honestly. So again, my role was trying to find a meta that worked and resonated and got the narrative across in the right way. Like, that wasn't easy, and we threw away lots of prototypes whilst the core work was going. I think in retrospect, probably a little bit too much innovation, which is something that we regret, but we're creatives and we're here to create, and there's always that thing that you have to get past, which is like, I know better, I can do this better. And then you try things out and you're like, okay, now I see why this is the leading design trope, because it actually solves a bunch of problems like really elegantly. I think everyone has to go through that at some point. So yeah, we went through a few versions of the meta. It sort of started off a lot more, it was much heavier on the narrative side, so it was probably more comparable to something like a Choices or an Episodes, but we were really playing around with consequence of choice. We wanted narrative choices that the player had to make, and we wanted that to matter somehow. But obviously, when you start talking about that to any narrative person, it starts worrying them, because what you're actually really creating is several different timelines of the possibilities within the stories. You have to find ways to anyway, there are complexities on that line, which led us to sort of scrapping it, basically. And I should really mention that we, I think one of our saving graces, we were so worried about proper world building and good characters and good writing that one of the best decisions we made was we hired a proper writer. Like, it wasn't just me doing it on the side. And so her name's Laura, and she basically, her background was more sort of like screenplays and stuff like that, and she was more writing novels. She had worked on games before, but it wasn't the mainstay of her experience. So she came on and she started doing the sort of the world building and sort of deciding who the main characters were and what the narratives were going to be. So after we sort of got rid of the choices like stuff, I moved more to I was thinking, about the core fantasy that we're giving the player. And that was, the cafe theme came about really early on, because, we love that as a setting. So we spent a lot of time trying to find a way to make that work. And the game sort of became more of a time management kind of a game, but like a very light time management. It was focused more heavily on the characters, like the customers coming in and you serving them, but that's how the narratives were coming about. And we tried doing that. I mean, ultimately it was a bit too light to be satisfying as a real time management game. So that didn't really work either. And like one thing that kept coming through really clearly in the playtests that we were doing, and we were doing lots of sort of qualitative surveys, was that people wanted more control over how their cafe was expanding and being designed.
So when you were doing these tests, sorry to interrupt you, but like when you were doing these like, play tests and stuff, was it mostly like internal, or did you use like a playtest cloud, or were you actually like fielding real people in, soft launched in a few countries at this point?
At this stage, it was primarily qualitative feedback that we were getting. So we were doing what we call friends and family tests.
Mm.
So obviously we're part of a bigger network, which is one of the advantages of being in Supercell. We have this network around us of other companies. Sort of Space Ape in London are kind of like our cousins. So the amount of times we would rope them in and be like, hey, play our latest prototype and give us feedback too. That was one avenue that we had. The other one, definitely, we used a lot of playtest cloud. So we were putting lots of builds out to players and sort of doing like multi-session tests, like the customized tests that you can do, making them play over several sessions once we had a bit more content, and just seeing how people were evolving. So really it was still very much in those early stages of evaluating the user experience more than anything else. We weren't even talking about retention yet, we were just trying to find the thing that worked. And in the meantime, the core work was ticking over, because that went through a few iterations, because there are lots of design considerations there. So these things were sort of being done in tandem. And then ultimately, I think I realized that, with this feedback that was coming through very strongly about people wanting more design and customization over their cafe, people love that setting. And they were like, I just want control over this. So eventually it made most sense to me to sort of do, a more traditional sort of, I guess you call it a puzzle and decorate game, right? In the taxonomy of games, that's one of how they
homescape style, yeah.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, to a certain degree. Again, my sort of designer's ego was like, but at the same time, it does a bunch of things really elegantly, and it works. And to a certain extent, it's what the players expect. So I think it's important to sort of pay attention to that, right? And I try not to be a knee-jerk reactionary whenever I hear someone doesn't like something, but if I start hearing the same thing coming through multiple times from multiple different sources, I think you have to pay attention to it. So yeah, we decided, that's the shape of the meta now. So eventually we put that version out. I think this was in 2020. This is when we actually started putting it out to real players. So we put it out to some, a few thousand players in some test markets, just to see how things were. And basically the bottom line was our numbers were okay. Like it was never a straight up disaster. But also there was this feeling that it hadn't really hit our internal quality bar or our ambition level. It hadn't really been met yet. Like we were slightly disappointed, So then what began was a sort of a period of really trying to find out what the issues were, and how they could be improved. We had some wins, some big wins. I would say the majority of like the A/B tests and stuff that we did sort of ended up being slightly disappointing. Like, that classic thing that I've heard a million times other designers say, where you do an A/B test and you can't wait to see what the results are, and there's this negligible difference, and you're like, in your head it was this huge change that you made, but in reality, I guess not.
Nothing really happens.
A few times.
How did you guys identify like where your problems were? I know some teams are more on the like, okay, we're going to do a lot of surveys and get qualitative. Some teams are like never touching surveys, doing all, data analysis. Some teams are a little bit more in the middle. Like, do you have a sweet spot for like how to figure out like what is actually the problem in this game? Because I think the first thing is you got to find the problem, and then you can come up with the ideas of how to solve it and do those tests on the problems.
Yeah. Well, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I don't think there's any one silver bullet for this. And I think this is the art of making games, really. I think this is what it comes down to. If it was easy, everyone would be sailing their solid gold yacht around, the south of France. So what do we do? The first step is always analyzing your funnel, right? You get your funnel and you have all your tracking events, and you see where the sort of precipitous drops are, and you analyze that section of the game, and you say, you know, is there something that can be improved here? Often that's the onboarding, you know, the Fatui. So there was a lot of that going on. I think, again, because we had innovated in the core mechanic, what we found was players more or less understood how the core mechanic worked, but they didn't quite always necessarily get to the mastery phase, which is something that we noticed with our level pass rates. So if we had specific levels that required a mastery of a certain, or an understanding of a certain rule in the game to pass, those pass rates are always really low. So we kind of identified that, you know, the tutorial wasn't quite doing its job. So that was a long time spent just reiterating and coming up with new tutorials. I think, you know, Tristan was tearing his hair out by the end, the amount of time that he wrote the tutorials. Again, this comes, you know, if you innovate on the core mechanics, this is the kind of thing that you can face, right? Because it's not a problem that's been solved by anyone else if it's a new mechanic. So we were definitely facing a lot of problems for the first time, and it wasn't, we couldn't just look at what someone else was doing to see how they solved it, which makes things harder. There was that aspect of things. We were never completely sure, in all honesty, whether there was a problem with the core or the meta. I think because the meta had become something a little bit more recognizable, I was less worried about that. But at the same time, there's the argument that, well, maybe people are just bored of this kind of meta by now. I mean, it wasn't a mansion that you were fixing up, but you know, it's adjacent to that kind of territory, right? So my suspicion was we ended up adding sort of some new features to the game that were trying to improve on certain aspects of the retention, maybe in a longer term retention aspect, or things like that, the appointment mechanics, like the tip jar thing that I designed, which I think you mentioned on one of your LinkedIn posts once.
Oh yeah.
So that was a, you know, was very inspired still in 2020 by Clash Royale and their chests system. I don't think I've seen anything come along ever since that in terms of sessioning that's as elegant as that. So I was like, well, what does that look like for casual? And I came up with this metaphor for the tip jar, which was this thing that you voluntarily put out, and then the bigger the jar was, the longer it took to fill up. So you were kind of designing your future session by, you know, which jar that you picked. All of those things, we kind of revert to those as playbook features, things that are kind of like supposed to be performance catalysts, right? That lay on top of the core game. And I think, you should never expect those to solve something that's underlying. Like if the engine isn't working, then you shouldn't just whack a turbocharger on top of it, right? You have to fix the underlying problems first. But also, you know, if those kind of features, like we put our first live op event in, and I think it was a pretty good event, but it didn't have the uplift that we expected. And I think that's really a symptom of the fact that the core kind of wasn't doing its job. As much as we loved it, I mean, we still love the game, and I think that was part of the problem, is that we were really proud of what we had made, but it just wasn't quite there.
So, you know, yeah, I don't know exactly what you can share, but maybe like a blended T1 day 30, like, you know, what sort of indications did you have that the game, you know, just wasn't there, aside from, you know, maybe like people failing those mastery type levels?
Yeah. So, well, again, it wasn't awful. Our day 30 for the old version of the game was somewhere around sort of 7-8%, something like that. So it wasn't a disaster by any stretch of the imagination, you know, like that's okay. It's not best in class, but it's not a disaster either. But again, there was this feeling, I mean, I always had the feeling that the product wasn't quite sitting right in my mind. Like I didn't feel like it was great. I felt like it was good or okay. And there were some elements that I really liked, and there were some that I wish were better.
Yep.
And I think in various degrees, everyone felt like that a little bit. So I think if you compare that to, you know, if you fast forward to now, if you compare that to what we're doing now, you know, it's more or less 20% our day 30 retention rate in T1 countries. So I think that shows like the pivot was a good one. You know, when you start seeing numbers like that. But I think for me, the biggest problem really was the monetization, because again, we were trying to monetize it like a traditional match 3 game. So I'm sure you're aware, like the majority of in-app purchases in match 3s is usually what we call the EGP, the end game purchase. So that's the +5 moves that you get at the end of the level, right? So that's that's the vast majority of the money that you make in any match 3. And what we were finding was we did a sort of a level balancing analysis where we looked at, so we have this statistic called APS, attempts per success. So that's basically, you know, how many times did it take a player to, you know, all of their fails plus the try that actually succeeded. Like that's what that number is.
Yep.
And then what we did was we looked at sort of what proportion of those fails were a close fail. So you have to define for the game mode or the set of blockers or whatever it is, what a condition would be where it's like you're almost there. So that has to be defined per game mode, right? So what you have to do is then create a ratio, and you look at how many of those fails are a close fail. And so we did a bunch of analysis like this, and we were, you know, we tried making some levels harder and making some easier, and you know, we did some extensive work on that, and we did increase monetization, but not to the point where we needed it to be. So our opt-out wasn't particularly strong. So for me, that was another sign that, you know, there was something wrong with the core. I had some theories on what was wrong with it, but, you know, nothing that you could ever point at a graph and say, this tells us this is exactly what's wrong, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that the single greatest game for those like close fails is Royal Match. I don't know how they do it, but it's like nearly every single time I always end the level with like the huge bombs right beside each other, and it's like +5 moves. You can beat this level, you can blow up everything, get all that satisfaction, and it's just like sitting there.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember playing Royal Match completely randomly when I was doing research, when we were working on the old version of the game. I downloaded it, and immediately I knew that I had something. And it was, you know, the devil's really in the detail with this stuff sometimes. I think a lot of people just say, we'll just whack a match 3 in, and then, you know what I mean? There's actually the art of proper level design and all of that stuff is often overlooked, I think. And I think that team has really proven that, you know, even in the reddest of oceans, like if the right team can come along with the right execution, there's nothing even particularly innovative in the product that you could point at and say that this is why they're doing so well. It's just really well made.
Yeah. It's very smooth. So anyways, back to the game, you know, pre-pivot, like so you guys are all kind of feeling like something's not quite there. You know, what sort of conversations started to happen like internally, and like when did you guys kind of all start to have this moment where, hey, we need to make another pivot because 7-8%, you know, D30, something just seems off. It's not right.
Well, by this point, I think it was sort of, I think by the end of 2020, we thought that we'd be globally launched by now, basically. But, you know, getting certain things right and getting, you know, sort of enough positive green flags in our KPIs to sort of, you know, to do that. We hadn't got there yet. So we started seriously discussing, you know, we really need to time box, you know, again, especially a game startup in our position, you don't have this infinitely sized war chest. So, you know, you have to be decisive. So I think what we decided was, and I think like Kara was really instrumental in this part of decision making, where it was basically, we're gonna globally launch something by September 2021, and whatever, you know, that's the time frame that we have now. Whatever we find out in that time, we will adjust our strategy accordingly. So we had one last ditch attempt at putting out an update for the old version of the game that we hoped would make a big difference. And meanwhile, what we did was we examined what a plan B could be, and we had, you know, some discussions, high-level discussions about what that game could be. There was a few different options that we could have picked, and ultimately I think we felt like merge games were the best opportunity for us going forward. So what we did was they basically freed me up from any responsibilities to the game, and I and a developer, an artist, and our UX guy basically moved away and started a small internal, kind of like a skunkworks team. And then we basically started figuring out a plan for a plan B. And we time boxed it, and we were very rigorous with this time boxing. I personally love time boxing things because it forces you to be decisive.
Yeah.
There's nothing more intimidating than a blank canvas, but when you can start putting some constraints in, I think you actually get faster progress. So yeah, we decided we were going to make a Merge 2 game because it was not too dissimilar to what we already made. We felt like we loved our meta, and we love the content that we build. Like, it takes time to build good characters and story and content. So one of the key design constraints really was, whatever the new version of this game is, it has to work with the meta as it is, pretty much as much as possible. So that helped me as well, because it forced me to really consider what would work. If I'm surgically removing this old core and putting something new in, that core loop has to keep working, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've seen, as an aside, Colin Foss from Skunkworks, the guys that did Merge Friends, he did a talk on Elite Game Developers about how to build a Merge game in 8 weeks, and that came out pretty much at the very beginning of this process that I was going through, so it was very, very timely. But he gave a great talk about some of the pros and cons of different types of Merge games. So yeah, we saw some opportunities in that place where we thought we could bring our AAA casual puzzle sort of like chops, our execution, and if we bring it to the space, and we apply innovation in the right areas, then maybe we'll find some good stuff to do. So yeah, that's what we did, and we started off and we set ourselves a goal, which was originally it was 2 days worth of content, and then very quickly, as we started building and playing this game, we did feel like immediately this is a huge improvement. Like, to me, it just felt right as soon as we started getting our hands on it, and the team felt similarly. And meanwhile, the old update that we put out came out, and it didn't meaningfully move the needle in any respects, unfortunately. So basically what we did was then we brought the rest of the team over. We expanded the goalpost a little bit, and we said, actually, now what we want to do, we want a day 30 read as soon as possible. Let's stop worrying about what a day 1 is, and let's start worrying about what longer term retention is.
Yeah.
And that first test that came out was really positive, fortunately. And it kind of put us on this trajectory where we were suddenly energized, and we had the results. Like, this team had worked so hard.
Yeah.
Like, we deserved a win. We had a win. And that was exactly what we needed at that moment. It sort of boosted morale, and yeah. So
I'm really glad you got to keep the characters, because that was probably the thing that I loved the most about the game compared to like other match 3s. It was like there's like mystery, potentially murder, there's like romance, and like all these things where I'm just like left hanging. It's like, well, I want to keep playing this match 3, and I don't even like playing match 3 to uncover the story and stuff. So that was pretty awesome.
That was actually what you're talking about was one of the big improvement points that we'd had on the previous version of the game. So when we initially built that version of the meta, we had the storyline in, but it was all a bit too cozy. And what we realized was, like, we want the coziness, but it needs intrigue and mystery and drama and stuff as well. So this idea of the cozy telenovela came about, which was, Caro was watching a lot of these kind of like Netflix soap opera kind of programs at the time, and she was like, let's bring some of that into it. And actually, that was a really good decision, because I think, it had a marked improvement in our early retention.
Now, when you were kind of doing this aside little Skunkworks type, project, was it strictly like you were just trying to get the core loop to work as quickly as possible, or were you trying to like fix or solve any of the existing let's say, issues with like Merge Mansion, which is kind of like the big de facto merge game that kind of came out there. Like, I know when I was talking to Voodoo, some of the things that Neek was trying to solve was like board space and general scalability, a weak link between the metagame and core, illogical merge change. They tried to make it a little more casual UX, more of a specific theme, and then like a non-standard narrative where like some of the things that they tried to add in. But like, were you just like trying to get something to work quickly, or did you like, were there any problems that you tried to kind of like solve and orient in there as well?
Both. Trying to do both, basically. I mean, for start, like, Merge Mansions is a great game. There's loads of great merge games that were feeding into what I was playing everything I could get my hands on. Anyone in my position, that's what you do, right?
Yep.
Especially if it's a genre that you haven't worked in or made anything in before. Like, you just have to do your research. So I was playing everything I could get my hands on, and there was a couple of key areas that I identified in the subgenre in general, not in any specific game, but in the subgenre in general. I was sort of saying to myself, yes, board space, when you have that restricted, Merge Dragons has this expanding island that you can always put things in, but when you have a sort of like a 7x9 grid, how do you keep adding content over time into the core? And when there's key design problems occur. There was definitely a few opportunities that I recognized. I think live ops in general was one where I just felt like if we can bring our sort of, again, our AAA casual chops to this and really apply our kind of thinking to the live ops layer, I think we could have something special. And maybe that's as much innovation as needed, but also, what is it that's keeping the player around in the long term? So in a traditional match 3 game, you regularly release new mechanics for the core, right? So you release new blockers and game modes and that kind of thing over time.
Yep.
What's the equivalent of that in a merge game? Because it's effectively a static space. So that's a problem that you need to solve, right? Because otherwise it's going to be a pretty static experience in the long term.
Yep.
So there's some pretty obvious challenges there, and but I identified those quite early on, and also our thing is the narrative, and like I really wanted to make sure that the link between the core and the meta and the narrative and everything was explored as fully as it could be, whilst still moving fast. So I think we struck the right balance there.
Yeah, oh, that's great. So for folks that maybe haven't played your game, what does live ops actually look like in it? How did you come about deciding what to do there, and then what does that look like? And did you test that at all before going live?
Did we test live ops before going live?
Yeah, I mean, or globally launch, I guess. What does live ops look like in your game, and how did you kind of come to that approach?
So live, we only have one that's live currently. One event, that is. I mean, live ops is an umbrella term, right? I think it becomes shorthand for
Sure, yeah.
But really, it's everything, isn't it? It's like sales and
yeah.
Anything that's kind of relatively time limited as content, I suppose, could be considered as live ops. Well, we made some pretty key hires. We hired a product manager pretty much just before we globally launched. So he's been definitely helping me with create the roadmap, the product. I sort of outlined a product vision. It's been kind of a crazy scramble because we made this 30-day content build, got amazing results, and then pretty much since then it's been full steam ahead. Like let's get this thing out. So I was suddenly in a position where I had gone from we need to find something that fundamentally works to now I need a concrete strategy for how this thing is going to exist as a product for the next 5 years. Which is a kind of a different headspace.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of a privilege because usually you spend most of your time on step one. So I presented a vision to the team sort of earlier this year, which was kind of like a holistic product vision, kind of how I see the future of the game shaping up. And all we're doing now is we're executing that against that, right? So we have a roadmap, we have these things planned out, we've debated what should come first and what can come later and all that kind of stuff. And now we're just going to be rolling these things out. So I guess keep your eyes peeled. I can't reveal too much at this stage, but I think as the new features get added, and if you keep playing, then you'll begin to understand what it is we're trying to do.
That's super exciting. That's great. Yeah, I think I did want to touch a little bit on, monetization in like a merge game. So, I've heard from some people, I'm not going to name names and I'm not going to name games, but like a lot of these merge games are coming out and they're scaling quite effectively to like 200,000 daily active users. And then they're just kind of stalling out and not really seeing many able to go beyond that hump. And also seeing kind of a lack of monetization once you get past that like initial hump in a lot of them at least. And so kind of curious, like the +5, the psychology of that, especially when you tie that into like a live ops event, like you see in Homescapes, where it's like you got to win, 10 in a row, and you got to use the +5 moves on like game number 9 to versus restarting it all over again. Like it just adds a lot of like spending pressure for, getting towards those big rewards and things like that. What does monetization look like, within the context of kind of the new merge game? And have you thought about, long-term monetization? And if you can't share stuff, that's cool too, but I'm just kind of curious, what your thoughts are and what you guys have learned.
Well, I mean, this is very topical. To a certain extent, I can't say because it's kind of our long-term bet for, the actual strategy that we're going to follow, our long-term bet for. That was one of the key things I identified early on was, I'm aware of this idea that actually part of the vision presentation that I gave was talking about this issue. And the comparison that I made was, if you think about the inherent complexity of the game, there's a kind of exponential complexity thing that happens with merge games compared to a match 3. So the value proposition of 5 moves to someone in a match 3 game is the same at level 10 as it is at level 1000, effectively, right? That 5 extra moves. So you can actually see that if you look at, I don't know, if you take Candy Crush for sake of example, right, and you look at the long-term monetization, you can see it's kind of flat, like the overall revenue curves. I think merge games are more akin to a game like an RPG or like a build and battle game, which where there's like a power curve, right?
Yep.
And the long-term problem with those games, like designish problem that they have to solve is how can we keep releasing content if we have to keep making things more powerful, effectively? And also, if numbers are sort of exponentially increasing, what's the value of $1? And what does it get you? How much progress, visible, tangible progress, does it give you as a player? And you see this to a certain extent in merge games, right? So, $1 can get you lots of satisfying progress early on, and then as the amount of effort required to make bigger and bigger items increases, the amount of visible progress that you make decreases. So I think that's definitely something that we're thinking about all the time. I have my theories about how we're going to tackle that, but I probably can't talk about that.
Yeah, I remember one GDC, I was talking to a buddy of mine from Big Fish Games who was quite the whale in Clash of Clans. And he was like, yeah, early on, I was spending like $300 a week and just like crushing through that game. It was so much fun. And he's like, but I haven't spent in like 2 years now because, $100 would buy me like a single Archer Tower upgrade. And it was like, well, it used to be $100 would get me like all this stuff. And now it's like, well, what's the point? So super interesting to think about. I think the other interesting opportunity that I would see for a game kind of like yours is, I've seen progression where like, you had Candy Crush first, and I know there's other ones first, but we're going to pretend Candy Crush came first. And what were the problems in Candy Crush? It's like, well, playing through these levels, one after, like, there's really no meaning to them. So like, why am I doing this? So for those people, now there's homescapes or gardenscapes. Why am I playing these levels? Well, so you can, repair your garden or fix your home or whatnot. But then, within that, it's like, well, where did I get this mansion from? Why am I like, what's this random garden? There's no context and stuff. And then, came like Lily's Garden, where they added this kind of rich narrative level on top of that and stuff like that. And so, I'm particularly fascinated with the live ops events that like Lily's Garden does, and now they've got the Penny and Flow, which is super interesting there too. And so you've got these like layerings and like time limited events where the rich characters kind of come in, and collection mechanics and things like that. I think can be super cool there. But yeah, I'm excited to see where you guys go from here.
Yeah, thanks. Me too. I hope we pull it off. I think I feel really confident in the team. I think the most important thing out of all of this that we've learned is really what you need is a team. Like, great games are made by great teams, effectively, right? Which is a cliche, but it's also true. And what a great team really is a team who can continually pick themselves up and dust themselves off after disappointments. I think specifically, it's easy to be cohesive as a unit when things are going well, which luckily we're experiencing a little bit of right now. But we've been sort of tempered by the fire of just continual like trying things and not getting them to work, and but we've kept going, and every time we've gone back to the drawing board, it's been with the same amount of energy. So yeah, I'm pretty proud of that.
That's awesome, man. Cool. Well, are there any other, topics or things that you had noted that you wanted to make sure that we cover today?
I don't think so. I guess there's one thing. I mean, I think there's this idea with merge games, which we had to disabuse ourselves of pretty quickly, which was like any old person can slap together any old merge game and it will be like, you'll get a great retention immediately. I think kind of to what I was just talking about with the team and stuff, like, the devil was really in the detail with regards to this stuff. Kind of just like with the match 3 games, there are lots of people who have worked in the industry and they still have it in the back of their mind. They could probably pull off a Candy Crush anytime they wanted, right? Like, it's just it's easy, right? You just put it's a simple game. Actually, it's not as simple as you think it is. And actually, there's a range of benchmarks that we've had from different platform reports and stuff like that over the last couple of years, where there is a range of different KPIs and stuff, and it is possible to make a benchmark and not hit great retention straight away. So it's already a space that's getting redder. The ocean is definitely. So yeah, I guess that's the only other thing that I made a note of.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's too soon to ask anything of this, but there's all these earning calls where IDFA is actually taking down some of the bigger companies out there. I'm curious, has IDFA had any sort of impact on UA and targeting and stuff for casual merge players, or is it so broad or so new that we don't really know yet?
I'm probably the wrong person in Trailmix. Our head of growth, Eugene, would have a good answer for this. Almost certainly, to a certain extent. To what extent, I can't really go into detail on. But I think it's affecting everyone in certain regards. Yeah.
Cool. That's great. Well, I do have one final question for you, because it is the Mastering Retention podcast, of course. And that is, what's one tip or trick that you've learned over the years to, increase player retention? Like, how do you get people to stick around and play your game for longer?
Yeah. Well, I knew this question was coming. I was thinking about what I was going to answer. And obviously you've had lots of great answers to this question already. So sort of treading new ground is a tough one as well. I suppose my pithy sort of smart ass answer would be just make sure the game always has something that the player wants, which sounds, kind of stupidly simple, but it really, that's what it comes down to, right?
How do you know that they want something or what they want, though? That's the real question, right?
Yeah, well, that is a good question. Yeah. But I think often in life as well as in games, actually achieving goals is kind of an anticlimax, and striving for things is what actually sort of makes you more content. And I think that's true, very true in games. So I think really it's about ensuring there's always something to aim for, at least in theory. If it doesn't work out, then obviously you need to go back to the drawing board and reassess what that goal is. But sort of like nested long-term goals. I think you talked about the Tower of Wants recently in one of your recent interviews, that thing that Ethan Lever did for the GDC talk that he did.
Yeah.
And that's the framework that I'd use. And it's a good way of visualizing what is it that the player is supposed to be caring about, at least.
So what is the Tower of Want for Love and Pies?
I don't know how to answer that without sort of
sharing your vision.
Yeah, that's a tough one. We have one.
We'll loop back in like 2 or 3 years, and we'll go through what's the Tower of Want and see if everyone can kind of outline it accordingly.
Maybe we'll do an update when it's out there. Yeah,
love it. Cool. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I look forward to doing a rewind episode once Love and Pies has just completely taken over the world, right? Be super, super exciting to see where you guys are going. Again, if you guys haven't checked out the game, download it. It's super fun, super interesting. And Matt, appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.